Hi everyone. In this video we're going to talk about the aggregate demand curve, and for us the aggregate demand curve is going to show the relationship between two things, price and essentially real GDP, holding everything else constant, holding all else constant. Now, let me talk about this for just a second. So when I say price here, I don't mean the price of an individual good or service. I'm talking about an aggregate price level, such as the GDP deflator, which takes into account the prices of not just consumer goods, but investment goods, government purchases, the prices of exports and imports, or the chain type GDP price index, which does essentially the same thing. I'm not talking about the price of apples. I'm not talking about the price of oranges. I'm not even talking about the consumer price index or the producer price index. We need a much broader measure of the average price level, which looks at all goods and services produced within the country. All right. Second, when we're talking about real GDP here, we're talking about consumption, investment, government, and net exports. So we're talking about the spending side of GDP. So you can really think of the aggregate demand curve as telling you about total spending, or let's just go ahead and call it aggregate expenditures. Now this will be important when we talk about what shifts the curve later on. Essentially, I'm telling you to think of the aggregate demand side of the economy as being driven by aggregate expenditures. Total expenditures by households, firms, the government, and what's going on with net exports. Okay? Now, the aggregate demand curve is going to show the relationship between the average price of all goods and services, P, total spending, which for now we'll call Y, holding everything else you could possibly imagine that influences total spending or aggregate expenditures constant. So we're going to hold government spending constant. We're going to hold, what's going on with consumption expenditures, investment, and net exports. We're going to hold all that constant, except to the extent that changes in the price level influence it. Okay? So now I just want to go ahead and derive the aggregate demand curve, and we can go ahead and do that. We've done something similar to this several times before. So I'm just going to pick an initial price. Oops, let me erase that, make that a little bit neater. An initial point, and I'm going to draw it relatively high. You'll see why in a second. Or initial price, and I'll call that point A. And here's real GDP. Okay, that's supposed to be Y1. So that's just the initial combination of the average price level and real GDP. Now I just want to ask the following I want to ask the following question, which is a thought experiment. What if the average price level fell, but everything else remained constant? Okay, so the price level falls to P2. The question is, what's going to happen to real GDP? Now here I have to think about what's going to happen to total spending out there in the economy. And as it turns out, there's three reasons to think that real GDP is actually going to increase, or total spending is actually going to go up. And that will move to a point like B, where real GDP is at Y2. So we think a fall in the average price level will lead to an increase in aggregate demand, which means if I connect two dots, call 2 points a line, let's make those dots a little bigger and take care of that. This is what the aggregate demand curve looks like. Okay. Now the key question is, why does the drop in the price level lead to higher real GDP? Well, here, let's scroll down a little bit to write, actually, can I do it? No, I'm going to have to scroll down to about this point here. If you remember, real GDP, or aggregate expenditures, is C plus I plus G plus NX. Okay? And it turns out there's three reasons why we think a decrease in the price level is going to cause an increase in GDP. First, if you decrease the average price level, then you're going to increase real wealth. And real wealth is nominal wealth, which I'll just call wealth, divided by the price level. It's almost like if you have $1 million in stocks, and your stock remains worth $1 million, but the price of all goods and services falls in half, which is essentially what we said, the price level falls. Then you can use your $1 million worth of stock to buy more food, more clothing, more cars, more houses, more of that stuff. Which means there should be an increase in consumption expenditures, which If we're holding everything else constant, in this case I, G, and NX, then if we decrease the price level, then it causes an increase in consumption expenditures, which should increase real GDP. Hence, we have real GDP moved over to the right here, or Y2 is to the right of Y1. All right, so that's one reason. So sometimes this is called the wealth effect, okay, because it happens through real wealth. Another possibility is decrease in the price level causes an increase in the real money supply, and we'll talk more about this later. So this is money, and this is the price level. We'll talk more about this in the chapters on money and banking, and the Federal Reserve and that type of thing. And you might think, hey, isn't this kind of like the wealth effect? Because isn't my amount of money, and however you want to define that, a component of your wealth? So isn't this the same story? And the answer is yes, but here we're emphasizing there's a decrease in real interest rates. And we'll talk about why later. So for right now, we'll just say a decrease in the price level causes an increase in the real money supply. Real interest rates fall. And as you might remember, the real interest rate is the cost of borrowing, so to finance investment expenditures. So if the real interest rate falls, the cost of borrowing to finance investment expenditures falls. So there's going to be a bunch of investment projects that before were not profitable but now are. So there'll be an increase in investment, which will cause an increase in GDP for exactly the same reasons as I talked about before. Except now, if we're holding consumption, government, and net exports constant, if you decrease the price level, we see that that's going to lead to increased investment expenditures, which must increase real GDP. All right, let's do one last erasure. The last way is if you decrease the price level of goods and services produced inside the United States, then that's going to, essentially what you're saying is domestically produced goods and services have become cheaper than they were before because the price level has fallen. So the price, let's say the price level falls in half. That means the price of automobiles produced in the U.S. falls in half. The price of everything produced in the U.S. falls in half. Well, if that's the case, then U.S. goods are going to be cheaper, so that's going to decrease imports. So U.S. households will have more of an incentive to buy U.S.-made cars rather than imported Japanese or German cars. Also, since U.S. goods became less expensive, that'll increase exports, which increases net exports, which leads to an increase in real GDP. Okay? Now, sometimes you'll see this explained by, hey, there's a decrease in the price level, and that has an effect on the exchange rate, and that affects the price of goods and services. It's essentially the same effect. This is a little bit of a shortcut, but it gets the general direction right. So in this version of the story, that if we're holding consumption, investment, and government expenditures constant, then if you increase net exports, then GDP has to go up. Okay? So there's basically three reasons why we think the aggregate demand curve slopes downwards. A fall in the price level, oops, let me erase that. A fall in the average price of goods and services leads to higher household wealth, so they consume more. The fall in the price level leads to a larger real money supply, which lowers real interest rates for reasons we'll explain later. That leads to more investment. Fall in the price level means net exports rise. And as a result, I guess I should put, for completeness here, this leads to an increase in GDP. And so, in other words, a fall in the price level will lead to an increase in consumption, an increase in investment, and an increase in net exports. And as a result, GDP goes up, so a fall in the price level is associated with an increase in real GDP. Now, I haven't said anything about the magnitude of these effects. I haven't said whether the effect is small or large, so I haven't really told you anything about the steepness of the aggregate demand curve. We're not going to get into that too much, so I'm just going to stop right here and say this is the derivation of the aggregate demand curve. And to remember that the aggregate demand curve is basically a story about total spending or aggregate expenditures in the economy. So when you're thinking about aggregate demand, you're thinking about total spending. And we're going to come back to this thought experiment in the next video when I explain why the aggregate demand curve shifts.